presentation, I'm going to be talking about RESTful API logging with a couple of tools called Serilog and Seq. These are tools that I've used and have embedded into SnapDevelop kind of middle tier solution for a client, and I'm going to be going into some of the basics of the setup and running it and looking at the logs and all the things that are associated with that. So I'll get my slide going here. The disclaimer that we're asked to present. The session agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project background, the setup and implementation for Serilog and Seq, some demos running the client application, how the PowerBuilder client calls into the API that kind of kicks off some of the logging that's involved. Review some of the log files, both the physical file and what you can do with Seq. A demo of Seq, of course. It has some powerful filtering components that are really useful. My name's Thomas Rolsev. I am a developer with Intertech Consulting. I've been using PowerBuilder since around 1995, version 4, I think. I came from a music and arts administration background, and one of my first jobs out of graduate school was with a nonprofit foundation, and right away they migrated to a PowerBuilder application, so that's kind of how I got my start there. Since then I've worked with EA Server. I've done a lot of web development with PowerBuilder and ASP Classic, .NET, and then more recently have been utilizing the SnapDevelop tools for migrations and other solutions. Again, I work with Intertech Consulting, one of the oldest and largest consulting firms specializing in PowerBuilder technologies. An Appeon partner, have a great team with such as Don Clayton, John Strano, Ronnie Poe, Jeff Gibson, myself, Jeff Waite. A lot of knowledge behind what we do, so moving into the project summary, we have been involved with Intertech, I should say, has been involved with PMEX, also known as PPI, for a long time. They provide procurement services to the Mexican national oil industry. Again, they've been with working with Intertech for over 10 years. They have two large systems called High Tech and LIS, which were developed in 3 tiers. The middle tier utilized something called Nextera, which was a C++ application. Kind of behaved a lot like EA Server would or has, for other PowerBuilder client server applications. Where we got involved was in the project was migrating their Nextera C++ code in the middle tier to SnapDevelop. We started this in 2019 with kind of a proof of concept project, and that turned into a full-blown migration. And I actually presented last year on some DevOps pieces of this project, where we're using Jenkins with pipelines, Bitbucket, Git, and the like, and that's so agile DevOps development, still a very integral part of what we're doing with them. But then since that time, we really delved into the moving their middle tier into SnapDevelop. The client application uses PowerBuilder 2019 R2. API is now at 2.1.0, so we started in the earlier version 1.0, and so part of the project was also to migrate that up to the latest and greatest. Just a little summary about the API. It's where it stands now. We've got 74 data windows that we have exported to the API. There are a total of 24 controllers, roughly 26 plus services, and about 480 methods all total. We've got a testing project that's part of the solution with XUnit. So there's quite a bit going on in this middle tier, and it's grown considerably since from when we first started. So moving on, the business problem and the requirements that we were faced, and again, this is my presentation is focusing on logging. There were a lot of requirements in the overall application, but as we got started and into it quite a ways, we realized that after having some meetings with the client, that the logging that we were doing became evident that it wasn't going to quite meet their needs. They in their middle tier C++, they had some logging methods that were already there, so we decided we wanted to try to reuse those as much as possible. And it became evident that they wanted to do some what are kind of tricky things in a way. They wanted to be able to track logging by user, by session, and it became apparent that just using a physical file wasn't always going to work in every case. And our questions came up: are you going to have separate physical files for each user, for each controller that they might run hit from the client? So things like that came up in our conversation. And of course, they also wanted the ability to turn logging on or off, set levels, and be able to do that easily without having to change code necessarily, and redeploy it. And so what we ended up doing was a hybrid solution using both Serilog and Seq. Now, Serilog is really the component that writes out to a physical file, and Seq is essentially a database that runs on a server that you can tap into and view log information. So the setup, using a lot of built-in power that SnapDevelop has, we were able to easily install NuGet packages for almost all of this, and that included Serilog. Serilog has a main package that you can install, and then kind of sub packages that help with various parts of things depending on what you're trying to do. Again, I mentioned Seq is essentially a database that runs in your browser. It's a lot like Jenkins in that way, and so it is something you have to install, download and install. And if you look at the resources slide here at the end, you can see a link for that. We needed to create a logging class to really capture all the logic in one place, that handles the logging. We needed to modify the app settings JSON file in the SnapDevelop solution, so that things could easily be changed. This acts as kind of a web config. We needed to modify the startup class, so when you make a call into the API, it's the first thing that's really getting called is startup.cs, and that's where the logger and the service logger is being instantiated and made available. I'm also using something called middleware, and that was used specifically because of our requirement to capture both user and session information. So it's not always necessary, but it was something that made things easier for us in our overall solution. We took what they had in the middle tier with their C++ application and took their methods for logging and overloaded them in an ancestor service. So we had a lot of flexibility with the different ways to pass parameters and different pieces of information that were important for logging. And then, of course, as the business logic grew in our SnapDevelop solution, adding log methods to controllers and services for debugging and error handling. So moving on to the next slide, this of course is an image of SnapDevelop, the solution that we're working with for this client. I have the NuGet package manager up, and this just shows you how you can search for packages that you might need. And so this is Serilog is the one that's highlighted here, and of course you can decide or choose which project, if you have multiple projects, that you're going to install it to, which version, and so forth. You can see there's not just the main Serilog, but there's one for ASP.NET Core, there's one for enrichers, extensions for logging. Sometimes it's a little confusing about what each of these what they do, so it's a little bit of research is required. I am actually using the Serilog Syncs package as well, because the whole concept of Serilog is that you can write out different logs to what they call syncs, and if it's not just a physical file and you need to do something else, that gives you that capability. When all is said and done and you've selected the packages that you want, of course they'll show up in your solution in the dependencies area, and you can see here there's a snapshot of some of the things that we've installed. Serilog for ASP.NET Core as well. Metrics, if you need that, moving up from the bottom up. Some syncs for Seq, configuration, and the like. So there's a lot of possibilities. Not all of this is needed for every situation, but it does really give you a lot of coverage depending on how powerful you need your logging to be. So I'm going to pause the slide deck here for a moment and switch over to demo. I just wanted to show you some things in our SnapDevelop solution and touch on that a little bit. So here we're in SnapDevelop. I've got a logging class highlighted. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but just again to reiterate, your NuGet packages for Serilog and Seq are going to come from the NuGet package manager here off the tools menu. And just real quickly, once this loads, it's first by default it's going to load up everything that's installed. And of course, if you need something new, so if you were installing Serilog for the first time, you could go to the browse option and begin typing what you're looking for, and it will go out and try to find the appropriate package. And so just wait a moment here while this pulls up. While that's waiting, oh, here we go. So this is this resembles a screenshot that I had up earlier, and you can select them, choose what you want to install to, what version. These NuGet packages, the version numbers change all the time, so you have to come back periodically and update them. Again, once you're done with all of that, ultimately once they're installed, as the slide deck showed, you'll have your packages loaded here. And really, I've got numerous Serilog packages here. The only one that I needed to install specifically for Seq was this one here, Serilog.syncs.seq. And I'll talk a little bit about that once we get into the logging class. So that's just a quick overview of the NuGet packages. Really powerful way to pull in other tools and frameworks that you might need for your application. And again, it's specifically we're looking at a suite of packages specifically for logging. So I'm going to switch back and over to our slide deck. So the logging class, I spoke of this a little bit a moment ago, and kind of got a quick view of the class inside of SnapDevelop. This really, it's used to instantiate the logging factory, which happens inside the startup. It uses a setting to control what gets logged, and we'll look at the code as well, in addition to the slide image here. But this is really what kicks everything off, and it's at the very top of your logging class, at least how we have it defined. Once we started building that out, I created a folder called extensions and put the logging class within that, along with some other things like security and service extensions. It's kind of a admin or / utility container for things that aren't necessarily your the business logic service methods that are going to be called by your client. So these are it's just putting them in a nice convenient place for, so that you always know where to go when you have to make a change for logging. The image here is, and again I'll cover this looking at some code, is kind of the heart and soul of the logging class. It's really where you're telling it how it should execute and work. It's pulling values from the app settings JSON file, which I'll show you in a little bit. You're getting things like a default template for the log, the name of the application, a Seq URL, if you're doing that, whether or not you want it to be disabled or not, the name of the computer. There's all kinds of things that you can add to the log. Down below, kind of in the middle, this is where the configuration actually kicks off. So there's some minimum levels. These two here are kind of interesting, and I'll talk about that in a minute when we actually get into SnapDevelop. There you can enrich your content, your log content, with different properties. And I mentioned writing to the concept of syncs in Serilog. What you do is you write to a sync, and in this case the file sync is a physical file. So you're writing out to a file format that has a particular template. You can also write to the Windows event log, and I'm also have a separate sync for Seq. And then once you've defined that, you create the factory, and then you can start logging. Middleware. This is, if you were to look at once we get to the logger class, we'll see this lower section here. This really I set up after doing some research as a way to get at session ID information and user information that are coming over the wire via a request header. Because basically every time you call into the API, it's a one-time it's a one-time trip. You make a call, and then all the information associated with that basically gets cleared out until the next call comes. So it's not necessarily easy to track a session ID in a .NET solution that way. So what we wanted to do is set a session ID when the user makes a call, when they log into the PowerBuilder client, and they move around, they do different things. They open one window, perform an action, close it, move on to the next window, and so forth. If we're storing the session header there in the client, it will always remain the same every time they make a call into the API. So that's really what the middleware is for. It's a way to was a way for us to capture a lot of different information from the request header. App settings JSON, very important, and I'll show you this in SnapDevelop. But there's a logging section. Within it has a bunch of parameters or settings, if you will. Things that are important here to note are, whether or not you want it disabled. The minimum level, you can have verbose, debug, warning, error. So you want to, if you set it too high, then you might be missing out on messages that you might need to track. The Seq URL, in this case I've got it loaded locally, so notice that in this instance, so I've got a local host with the port, and that's the port that Seq is running on. And a template, this is very important. This is going to control the look and feel and layout of the physical file that gets written, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. So let's move on to SnapDevelop, and we'll look at some code in a little more detail. Okay, so let's start with the logging class that we've created. Again, I touched on this a little bit from the slide deck. You can see all of our using directives up here, quite a few of them. Note that we're tapping into the dependency on the Serilog packages that we pulled in with these directives here. With Serilog, you can do, there's a lot of flexibility, and I've only touched on the surface of it. You can do things, what they call thread enrichers, so that essentially it lets you inject certain properties into your log. So in this case, we're not actually using it at the moment for this client. It was more of a kind of a case study for me, if you will, of getting it to work. And in this case, what this enricher does is it takes a thread ID, which is maintained as you make calls into the API, and it will inject that into the log. So just a general concept, you can have these different classes of enrichers with different properties that you could put into the log if you needed to. Here we get into the startup of the logging class, or logging factory, if you will. This is telling the startup to configure it, get it ready, prepare it, if you will. There is a section where it's going to go out and get a value from the app settings JSON file, and if it's not disabled, then we're going to allow the factory to write to the log. So again, this just illustrates how you could go into the app settings and easily change that, and basically your logging would be off at that point. The configure logging services is really the heart and soul. This is where we're pulling out a bunch of different variables, both from the environment as well as the app settings JSON file. We're setting a custom template. Now you could pull that out of the app settings file, or you could define a custom one. This actually is doing that right here, and it breaks it up into sections for the physical file that gets written. You have your timestamp information, what level you're going to report on, the request method. The client wanted to see the controller inside of the log, the message itself, and there's some formatting. Note that if there's ever an exception, there will always be a new line, and then the exception text for the error will get included there. Here we have some of the enrichers. I mentioned these guys earlier. You actually will get a lot more information than you probably need, and this is essentially telling the logger to turn the Microsoft and system information that gets added to the log off so that it doesn't get included. And really the next important piece of this is the file sync. So that's this right here. We're doing a write to asynchronously. We're passing it the log file. This is what the name of the and path to the file that we're going to write to. You can specify information, interval information, how big the file is going to be, how many you want to retain. Do you want the file size limit property turned to true? All of these things are covered in documentation for Serilog, and at the end of, I think in the resources section of my slide deck, there is a link to that that's very, very useful. If you are going to use Seq, then all you need to do, it's one line of code, is you simply establish another type of sync. You go write to .seq and you provide the URL, and everything that you've been and more that you've writing to the physical file will also get sent to Seq. And then we create a logger, a factory for it, and this actually will be the first, whenever you hit the API from the PowerBuilder client, this is going to be the first log message that takes place. And I like to do this because it just gives you a point in time where you can start going through the log when, you know, if you want to track down something, whenever you see this particular message, I can go, aha, this is where that particular session started. Further down, so there's a fair amount of code in this class. This is the middleware. It's a class called request logger, and I'll talk about how that gets added and injected in a bit. This basically, it does one primary thing, and that is to pull / extract information out of the request header that you've made. And when you do that, it takes that information, puts it the request body, and it writes it out to the log. And I'll show you, it's easiest to see what that looks like when you are using Seq, actually. Here is where I'm getting the user ID and session information out of the request header, and that now makes those values available both to the log, and if you put them into a user class, you could in theory access them, and which we do in this application in other controllers and service methods, because this particular client, the user was a very important parameter. It was passed into a lot of different methods and in their business logic quite often. So that's a little bit about the middleware. I've got some things that are commented out, things that I tried, just not using at this time, but wanted to keep just in case. But again, just to recap, the middleware, this request logger class, essentially was created to extract information out of the request header to be for reuse later. So let's switch back to the slide deck. Well, actually, let's finish up. I'm getting ahead of myself here. We wanted to talk about the app settings JSON. You can see I've got numerous sections, one for email, one for logging, app settings, other structures, the database connection string, things like that, all of which are important. Logging, you can see that disabled, it's false, so that means it will log wherever I tell it to do that. Minimum level, we talked about that in the slide deck a little bit. Again, the Seq URL. Not using the token, but it is something that you could. I have seen it used, just not. It wasn't something necessary for us. So let's go to the startup class again. Here you have to declare your logger factory, so that's what happens here, as well as your app settings and the logging class. So there's numerous components to that. Here we're setting a logging app name, getting that out of the configuration, out of the app settings. Same with a log indicator value, just in case we need that. Going down into the configure services area, this is an important section of the startup. Is of course where the database connection happens, where you inject your services so that you can access them, and then further down, this is where you actually tell it, all right, we're going to log with Serilog specifically, and that's instantiating the logging service so that it's available throughout the API. Another key part of this is in the configure piece or section of startup, is you're adding Serilog to the request pipeline, and then finally, this is where the middleware that I spoke of earlier, the request logger class. That's, you're telling the configure method here that we want to use middleware, and the name of the class that we're going to refer to going forward is the request logger. So once you've done that, every time you make a call into the API from the PowerBuilder client, it's going to be able to grab what's out of the request header. And you can see I've got we'll talk about this actually, how to call the logger, but again, earlier in the class I had a log start. Here's a log end, because this is where your round trip call into the API is going to finish. So that's a little bit about the startup class, the logging class, which is really the heart and soul of it. App settings, how that's used. So let's go back to the slide deck. So again, here's a slide specifically about the different components of the startup that we talked about: declaring your logger factory, enabling the service, adding a Serilog to the request pipeline, and injecting the logger class as middleware to get a hold of a handle on the request header information. So how does logging work? So how is it called inside the application? So we have, again, I mentioned earlier that we wanted to reuse some methods that were in the middle tier from the client's previous system. And notice up here there's a method called DCE debug write, and that's exactly what they had it called in their C++ middle tier. And what I'm doing here is I'm passing in the HTTP context, so that allows me to get request header out of it. At any point in time, I'm passing in a value for the log level, which is a constant, and then message parts. So a message might have one string, it could have two strings, it could have two strings and a integer that you're passing. So that's why I mentioned that we're going to have overloaded versions of this. So I think in actuality, in this particular solution, we've got about half a dozen of them. They use little escape characters in their C++ solution for their debugging method. So we ended up using regex to kind of strip those out and replace them with the parameters being passed in, and then it goes into a switch based on the log level. And this is really what writes to the log, both the Serilog, the physical file, and Seq. It's log.information or log.error or log.warning, and then the various parameters are passed into it as arguments. And ultimately what you end up with is a entry into a physical file, as well as an entry into the Seq database. So we put this in our ancestor service class, which made it, by doing that, made it available to call in any controller, any service throughout the API. Here's an example of writing to the log. This is a service method called getCities, which I'll actually demonstrate a little bit later, both from the client and in the API. We're returning a data store, calling getCities with giving it a city, a state, and a country, doing a retrieve on a data store that we exported to the API. I'm passing in, you can see if no cities were retrieved, it's doing a passing in the constant that it's an error. Not really an error in this case, but it's, possibly not what the user expected anyway. Some parameters that we're going to parse, the name of the service, service method, and then a message. If it is successful, then same thing, we're just using the debug constant, the number of the cities retrieved, and returning them, writing them out to, converting them to that number to a string, and then passing back the data store. This is the actual, finally getting into some PowerBuilder code here, what the REST-client API call looks like. So we created a broker object called nAPI-broker. Inside of its functions list, there's several dozen functions, one of which, some of them are overloaded. This one is OF retrieve, so we are making a call out to the API client, which we have, the URL is essentially well, the REST client object is stored as a global, and then we pass in the URL, and then ultimately you get a response back whether it was successful. Note that I am setting a request header of a user ID, a session ID, and the name of the controller. It's important to note that you need to clear the request headers when you make these calls, and sometimes after. Otherwise, you'll notice in the log file that every time you make a call, you're going to see the same session ID just duplicated. It gets added to the string in the file, and you just see it appended over and over again. So it's important to remember that to clear out your request headers to give you a clean state every time you make a slate, if you will, as you make your calls. So functions, again, to capture the controller and the session ID, clearing the request headers, and then, of course, in this instance, we're just setting three values: the user ID, session, and the controller. So at this point, I thought I would give you a demo of both the PowerBuilder client and just a little feel for some of the code there, and how we trigger, call into the API and perform an action that actually triggers a log entry. So I'm going to switch over to PowerBuilder first, and we'll take a look at the client application, and then look at two things that result from what we do. That would be the physical file created by Serilog, and the entries that get sent to Seq because of the sync that we have writing to that application. So here we're in the PowerBuilder client for the LIS application. I've got a window up here. It's called the city list. It's a pretty simple window, but it's useful to demonstrate just the basics of what logging can do. We've got a simple data window with 3 input fields and a retrieve button, and the code behind this, just to give you an idea of what happens, we're calling into the API right here. We're referencing our broker object. We're calling a OF retrieve method, passing in the data store, the URL for the API, and some parameters. When it executes, we get a response back, and that controls what type of messaging we're going to have in the client application itself. I'm going to show you the broker piece of this. We had a slide on this particular code earlier. This is the OF retrieve method. We're calling into the restclient object, passing in a query string, returning back status information by reference. We're doing a couple of important things as it pertains to logging. One thing, we're clearing the request headers. So every time we make a call in the API, we want to clear that out so that we don't get any duplication of the session ID and the user ID. Here you can see we're adding the user, which is a global, into the request header, as well as the session ID, which gets created via a function when the application starts up, and then the name of the controller. So those things are passed into the request header. We make the call into the REST client using the retrieve method, and then process the response code that comes back. So let's actually run this and see what this looks like in action. So I'm going to log in here. Make this a little bigger. Looks like a classic PowerBuilder client server application. Off the main menu, they have a module selection, and within that, maintenance. And so I'm just going to go city list. Brings up a window, the window that we were looking at earlier. So I'm just going to enter Boston, Massachusetts, USA, and click retrieve. We got a row back. So this action should have been logged. Entries should have been made into the logs for this what I just did here. So I'm going to close this down, and let's, as a result of what I just did there, let's look at two things. One of them is the physical file, which I'll spend less time on, and then more on Seq, just to really give you a feel for how Seq works and what you can do with it. So I have it defined in the API that a particular path and file name that this physical file writes out to, and you can see from here this text file that I have open. It's called lis_API, and then you can see today's date. When using a file sync like this, it's going to write its entries, from the earliest to the most recent. So that's one thing. It's the opposite in Seq, so it's just something to keep in mind. But you can see a bunch of entries in here, as I've been kind of doing the same thing over and over again to just make sure that everything was working right for the demo. Notice that each time I've logged in and made a call out to that retrieval of some cities from the API, our session ID has changed. So this number is different. So every time I log in, and it will create a session number, and it will maintain that as I make other calls into the API until I log out. And the next time I log back in, that number will change. I made essentially two calls. There was a call out to a controller to help me log in, and then there was a call out that got logged to what we call the city controller, which actually did the retriever of the cities. And you can see here that 3 were retrieved, and it has both the user ID and session. This was a requirement. They actually wanted to see both the user and the session ID in every log entry made. There are some cases where a log entry is made where it doesn't include that. That's just some variations that you run into. So pretty simple here. We're using the template that's defined in the app settings JSON file. So you've got the timestamp, the type of message. Is it a debug? Is it warning information? IMF is information. Is it an error? Is it an exception? So you have different levels, and that gets included as part of this first kind of timestamp section. It's telling you, is it a get or a post, what controller, the name of the service, a message that we're returning, and then other pieces of information that we wanted in every log message. So this can vary greatly depending on which service you call and what it is you're doing. So that's the Serilog file sync. So pretty straightforward. It's writing out to a single file. You could modify Serilog to write to multiple files. That's a possibility. In addition to the I mentioned earlier, I think that you could write to the Windows event log. So there are different syncs that you can incorporate into your logging class to handle things like that. So let's now switch over to Seq, because that's kind of where the fun begins. So here we are in Seq. As I mentioned earlier, it resides in a browser. So I've got Chrome running here. It's at localhost. When you've installed, you can install this on a server, and so you could access it over, over the internet, with whatever the URL or the IP address is, as long as you have access to it, and the firewall's open, and so to speak. Here again, it's just localhost. Seq always uses the port 5341 rather, and when you start it up, it defaults to the events page, and this is the main interface for Seq. I'll cover some of the other parts of it a little bit later, and in less detail, but this is kind of really the most important part, and you can scroll through the log. Whenever you start it up, it's gonna pull up everything that's out there. It's different from the file sync in that used by Serilog, in that it has the most recent entry first. So just again, something to keep in mind. The interface here, again, it shows you the log entries. You have a filter bar or filter section where you can type in commands to filter out things that you want to see or don't want to see, whatever the case may be. It has a drop down. It will remember things, search expressions that you enter. It has a drop down interface, so these are things that I've searched on recently that I can select from. If you click on any entry, it will expand it and show you a wealth of other information, not just the log message itself. So it's tracking all this other, IIS, Windows, system information that comes in handy. You can there are different pieces of this that you can select with your mouse and do different things. I don't know, I haven't dug into every single action that you can perform here, but there's quite a bit of stuff that you can do. You can do a find on certain things. Excuse me. Here I selected the action, so it's looking for all entries, log entries with the action with the ID of that particular code. If I hit the X over here, that's going to clear it out. We'll be back to where we started. So that again, the action code was this guy here. If I choose, there's different ways to get at certain things. So if I wanted to select, all get methods, I could do that. Go find, and now it's going to list all the gets. If I wanted to change that to post, I could select on any item. I need to find one that's a post. Let's see if we can. It's a get. Well, I thought I had a couple in there, but I think you get the idea. If the request method were post, you could select that, filter it out. So the received headers are what's coming up from the request header that we defined in the client. So you can see I've got the session ID, the name of the controller, and the user. Using Serilog, you can break that. You can essentially strip that out of here and give it its own field or location, and that makes it easier to access it. So that's why you see it in different places. This gives you a little more flexibility. So really, once you have your logging in place, the power with this then becomes what you can do with the filtering mechanism. So here, I can look for everything with a machine name that's called Ashgrove, which happens to be my computer name. I could then look for everything with this particular session ID. And again, all these previous entries that I've made are stored. I can look for everything that, so user Mbaruman. I can do something like this where the machine name is Ashgrove, the session number is this, and the controller equals city. So you can see that really pairs down what you're looking for. I can do something like this, a contains command. This is going to look for the action name property in this entry, whatever entry, where there's the letters SEC reside. So I'm going to hit that, and you can see if I open up one of these entries that it's taking the action name, it's doing a contains within on this string here, and it's finding this, so there's a match, and therefore it gets included. Just alternatively, I can do something slightly different and go contains action name client action, hit enter, and it gets a much smaller list of hits from the log. So again, I've kind of just scratched the surface on what you can do. We just wanted to make this available for a client, shared with them an important research, which is the Seq documentation, which I have here. So there's a whole section on filter syntax, what you can do with that, and you can do all sorts of things. You can send email in Seq. So if you have a particular action and you want to set up an event, if there's an exception, it could fire off an email to somebody. There's a lot of different things you can do. So I'm going to clear this out, get kind of back to our starting point. It has a dashboard. There's not a whole lot to display because my database actually is pretty small at the moment. If I look for the last 8 hours, you can see you'll get some different charts of events, errors, and exceptions, count by level, distinct event types. Again, if you decide that Seq is something you would like to incorporate, the documentation is pretty robust, and you can go through that to help it meet your needs even further. If I go back to the events tab, you can also sort these easily, quickly by signals, which would be I want to see only errors, I only want to see warnings, I only want to see exceptions, and so forth. So there's just a great deal that you can do with this. And if I go back to the no signals, it returns me back to my original state. So I encourage you to use their documentation to the full extent if you really want to dig into it. I found I just had to learn a few things in terms of filtering to get at what, to highlight to our client really what they would need to do. And primarily that was, all right, I want to get a list of all all logs for a particular session ID, and that's pretty easily done by doing something like this. This would limit it. If I only want to get user A who happens to be on the Ash Grove machine, where session equals this, you type that in, hit enter, and it will filter everything out. And then you can, if there were some error or something happened that you wanted to review, as long as you're logging appropriately inside of the application and your API, then that will get recorded, and you can do some debugging using Seq and the physical file. And I actually use both because the physical file can contain other things that Seq cannot, and vice versa. So I find it useful to have both. So that's a little bit about Seq, how it's used. We talked about physical file. We've talked about how to set up the logging class, how you can control how it works with settings from the app settings JSON file, how to instantiate and really create the factory that that controls the logging as you call controller methods. We talked a little bit about setting up an ancestor service class where you can create overloaded methods to do different things and add different pieces of message parts, if you will, that you want sent to the log. A little bit about how to call things in PowerBuilder that will trigger log entries, and which is exactly in the demo that I did a few moments ago. Really, that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing a process where I logged in, did a search on a city, and so forth. And you could take this a step further, and you could include the parameters that you entered for your city search as part of the request path, and those would also display there. And if with a little bit of work, you could split those out. That is, I hope, a good summation of what you can do with logging using Serilog and Seq inside of SnapDevelop. And I hope you found this useful. I will encourage you to the resources tab or slide rather in the slide deck at the end is really useful. There's some information about Seq, how to install it, how to use Serilog. You may not need to have it as involved as we did, so it could be a very simple thing to set up, depending on what you need or don't need. And of course, there's some reference links to SnapDevelop and some of the API references in its new version, and that kind of really works well. It's supported Seq and Serilog easily without much refactoring at all. It really it's as simple as pulling down some packages and setting up a logging class, and before long you can be on your way to logging the things that you need to and help out with your error handling and so forth. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.